So Julie is not here today. So Fiamma, let's get the social media roundup from you.
Okay, ready for sad news. So we have 130 followers on Instagram and on Twitter. Not so good. But we are actually improving a lot on Facebook. We have 600 followers because I spent hours and hours inviting your Facebook friends liking the page.
Appreciate you.
But honestly, I feel like most of them are bots.
You feel like they're boats? Whose boats?
Like robots?
My friends are boats?
Yeah, your Facebook friends are
bots.
fake.
My friends are not bots. Okay, they are not bots. All right.
Tomato.
No, Jack. She's talking to people from Kosovo. Maybe I don't know. I have a lot of friends. This is not right. My friends are not bots. They're real
They don't
people.
have even a profile picture, and the name are weird.
No. Okay, they are not bots. They are not boats. They are real people. This discussion is over. Invite them.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from Berlin, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic entity. On today's show, Monday, June the 7th, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, Ludovico Manzoni, Vijay, Prashad, Jamaä, Bickley-King, and featuring committee's deputy director, our own Julia Doubleday, and the rest of the committee gang. And now a man whose online friends are 100% grade A prime humans and not boats nor bots, your host, Arun Chaudhary.
Thank you. I also want to thank you on behalf of my 5,000 human flesh and blood, real names and real feelings friends on Facebook, okay? Offensive. I've never been so offended my whole life. I mean, I've been similarly offended, but maybe not more offended, all right? So we need to cinch it up around here. We need to get some feelings, empathy. It's the Joe Biden era. And there should be empathy. Malarkey. Do you know what I have in my hand right here, Jacopo?
No, what is that?
That's right. That's the prompt. I give it to you, give it back to me, and then we're moving. This is the schedule, actually, for the whole show from now until American Labor Day. So the rest of season 1, we have it all worked out, and then for the beginning, we'll maybe new ideas, whatever. We'll start on that with season 2. Remember, American Labor Day is not the same as real Labor Day. It's made to curtail and not celebrate workers' power. One of the many things we'll be talking about in these shows, we have a thing on Yemen, we have a thing on American interventionism actually today, we have a thing on constructive race in Latin America, a lot of really interesting stuff. We will have a segment in which a AI has been trained with my own scripts, and I will have to compete against it in a script.
So there are bots in the end.
All right, who sent you with this? Did Fiamma tell you to come in and ruin the monologue with this bot stuff?
I was just
They're
being
not bots,
curious.
They're people, okay? Maybe you don't recognize the names. Maybe they don't have photos. Maybe they're shy. These are real people.
There
real
surely
people.
is a man behind the bot, so I will...
Cross Atlantic crosstalk, let's get it up. Hi, welcome back to the show. We have our cross-Atlantic crosstalk gang here, Ellie Mae O'Hagan and Julia Doubleday, but we're also joined by Ludovico Manzoni, who, like myself, is in Rome, where we are suffering through some spotty internet. But let's do it, and let's start, Ludovico, with you. And now enough polls have come out that it is true. The first and second largest parties of Italy are both right-wing, perhaps in increasing order of it. Can you tell us kind of, look, people are always breathlessly reporting on 0.03% moving in the polls. I think now we do have something to report, right? Which is that the PD is the third largest party in Italy. I mean, how do you see these new numbers settling in?
I mean, yes and no, because yes, it's carrying the two far-right, quasi-fascist parties such as Lega and Fratelli Italia are number 1 and number 2. But if you look at the number of the numbers in a 2 years perspective, you can notice that the sum of Lega and Fratelli has kind of always been 40%. Like the last European election, it was 38% Lega and I think 7% Fratelli. Then in the polls it was 33% and 8, then 30 and 10, then 35 and 15. And now they're basically even. Basically Fratelli Italia has been all hollowing out Lega for a long, long time, and maybe they're going to surpass them. But yes, there's been a consistent 40% of the electorate who has, at least in the polls, gone for far-right parties in Italy.
I guess when we did our 5-star segment, I think the consensus amongst our panel was that precarious workers are really the people who the 5-star movement represent, that the Partito Democratico does not. Is when we see where those folks break, if they come back to the PD, or if they join a new center-left type party, or if they defect to the right, will that be a more deciding factor in the national elections we expect to be in the next few years?
Yes, and this process you mentioned already happened. Like, unfortunately, it already happened in some territories. Like, we've seen it in Liguria, for instance. We've seen it in Piemonte. We've seen it in many of the territories that used to be left-wing, where basically Cinque Stelle has been a sort of gateway from working-class voters to go to the right. Because this process has happened already, especially in the north, with working-class voters going first from traditional left parties to Cinque Stelle and then to Lega. Is it going to happen again in the south, also to Fratelli Italia? Let's see, but it's a very concrete risk, because in the past 5 years it happened already.
Let's switch gears to my favorite precarious worker in the UK, who is, of course, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party. That was a good. Did you like that? That was quite a thing. I did that. Look, people like us, consultants, communications people, will always say you got to get out there, you got to let people know who you are. I feel like people were very nervous in Keir Starmer's camp when he put himself out there to Piers Morgan for quite a long interview. Can you tell us a little bit about the roller coaster ride of expectations versus reality on this high-stakes PR moment?
I think it depends on who you ask. So I think the left were expecting, and maybe, dare I say, hoping, that it would be a disaster. And I think the calculation from Keir's team was one of the problems that we have is that people really don't know that much about him, and that once they get to know him more, they'll like him. And I have heard, I've not been canvassing with Keir, but I have heard from people that have, when he goes canvassing, like, people are really charmed by him.
I've been canvassing with him, and he was okay on the doorstep.
Oh, okay.
I thought.
Yeah, so I think it was, this like idea that if they just got to know him, then things would change. And I think both were wrong. I don't think it's been a game changer at all. And in fact, there's been polling since that shows it hasn't really changed anything. But I also think it sort of broadly went quite well. I think people were like, oh yeah, he's like actually a human being. He's not like this weirdo, which is good that they thought that. But I don't think it has changed anything in any sort of significant or long-term way. The problems with the Labour Party still remain.
And expounding on that poll a bit, I mean, is it like what Ludovico's talking about in Italy? Is it that the kind of, conservative right-wing coalition is coalescing in some certain ways? Or is Labour still bleeding to the Conservatives? I mean, we saw in this last poll, at least that I saw coming out, kind of an increasing plurality on the right side of the axis.
In our country, in the UK?
Yes, in the UK.
Yeah, I think I would say that basically until recently we had these sort of fringe right-wing parties like UKIP and the Brexit Party that would peel off the Conservative vote. But actually what seems to have happened in recent years is that those parties the Conservative Party has changed in order to sort of subsume those parties. But it hasn't lost any of the sort of centre-right people in its coalition as well. So, yeah, exactly. Whereas the left is sort of the opposite side, not necessarily the left, is still quite fragmented. So obviously we have the Labour Party, but the Greens are on 9% at the moment, which is huge for the Greens. The Lib Dems don't seem to be doing very well, but like also, you know, we have a coalition of voters that you need to persuade to turn out, whereas the Tories don't, because they rely heavily on retired voters who will always vote. So that's the other thing, is that we lose a lot of our voters to the stay-at-home candidate.
To get it back to the math thing, though, it's that the Liberals plus Labour no longer add up to the Conservatives, right? Like, there's no magical coalition on the center-left that beats the right now, right? I mean, that's sort of the I guess, the worrying thing in some of the polling.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's not any scenario where Labour wouldn't have to win back Tory voters. But I think it's also the case, and this is the thing that's like really often neglected, is that Labour needs to turn out people who don't turn out unless there's really something to turn out for. So yeah, but I do, you know, I was in focus groups yesterday, and they were about attitudes towards social security, and the groups were divided by how punitive their attitudes were. So I listened to the most punitive, and those people, there's no point in convincing them. They were like, they will never vote Labour or support anything remotely left wing. But the one sort of next one along, which is basically how they have punitive attitudes but can also be quite generous. Frankly, it was a disgrace that Labour didn't manage to persuade people like that, because they were open for the taking. You know, they expressed a lot of stuff that the Labour Party would agree with, that we would all agree with. They are, you know, generally they were quite thoughtful, they weren't particularly ideological, and they drew on their personal experiences to make sense of the world. So I actually don't think that winning back Conservative voters should be as onerous task as maybe we think it is. I just think that, you know, it happened in 2017 that we came really close, but I just think that other than that, the Labour Party hasn't really known what to say to them.
Or even taking persuasion as seriously as a tactic versus kind of, or, you know, trying to organize these coalitions of, you know, demographic coalitions, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's, maybe this is too harsh, but I've always thought one thing that's quite interesting about Labour is that it seems to be a bit afraid of its own voters. Rather than sort of seeing them as a group of people that it can find common ground with and, you know, it can relate to, it's sort of almost like they're these sort of unknowable gods that have to be appeased with, like, offerings of, like, light fascism and army worship and, you know...
This is... The Democratic Party as well.
I know, that's why I was laughing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Schumer, sorry to interrupt, but Chuck Schumer very famously has an imaginary working class or like middle class family in his head. They're like Irish Americans. They have names. Yeah, and he's like, oh, like, here's what I think Susan and Bob would like. And they're just like
it's a Sims game
an imaginary normal person that Chuck Schumer knows because he doesn't know any normal people in real life. He's like, what would it be like if I were friends with someone that weren't independently wealthy? Let me engage my brain, my imagination to think about how they might see the world.
We got to talk about it more sometime, Ellie, but I also think, like, you know, getting people in that room also just does alter the chemistry so much of the questions you ask, and I do think, like, we need to get out into the field with cameras doing these things, like, as part of a creative, even, a documentary process instead of filling people in rooms and asking them how they feel about stuff. I mean, yeah, I guess you're in a lot of focus groups, so it's helpful to see how they change from thing to thing. I just hate them as a thing, as an existence.
I love them, but I think you need to recognise their limitations. Like, they're not going to give you many policy ideas because you're asking people to think about things that they don't think about ever. So they're not going to necessarily come up with something helpful or even something durable, like that is durable with them. But I think what I like about it is it sort of gives you insight into the human soul. That's what I like. So it's rather than sort of thinking, what do these people think about this? I try and think about what gets these people out of bed in the morning. What do they care about? What do they worry about? You know, like, what do they feel? And I think, and those more like permanent, durable things that kind of come out in spite of what they actually say, I think is what they're useful for. Rather than like, I think the mistake that the Labour Party has made with focus groups is, you know, like Susan from like Blythe Valley will say, oh, I think this. So the Labour Party says, oh, well, we need to do that then. And I think like that's like the most useless and ineffective way of using focus groups.
We had Julia in America, 2 different takes on vaccine diplomacy. I saw you tweeting very angrily at a former representative from California about it. Can you tell us?
Angrily and professionally. So there was this announcement that the Biden-Harris administration is going to finally be releasing more vaccines internationally. They're sending 25 million vaccines, I think like 90% of which are going to be distributed through COVAX, which is this international partnership that's administered through the World Health Organization. And the goal is to get to, I think, 80 million by the end of next month, end of July. And then Congressman Ted Lieu of California, he's a Democratic congressman, tweeted this like it's not really bizarre in the context of US politics, but it's a bizarre thing to openly say in the context of how Democrats like to see themselves. So he was like, we shouldn't be basically he was arguing that we shouldn't be letting COVAX decide where the vaccines go. They should go to US allies first and then people we don't like later. So like, let's give them to Indian people first, and then Iranian, specifically, the example he used was Indian people first, Iranian people last. Like, let's give Iranians just like only the very, very last vaccines because they don't like America.
Shriveled up vaccines that nobody wants.
Yeah, so this is obviously like a very cynical way to look at the world. That being said, this is actually in practice the way that the US functions normally. It's just that we don't usually say it out loud. So, the way that our sanctions regimes work around the world is keeping life-saving food and medicine from children and people that need it. There's been talk, like with the sanctions in Yemen right now, of like humanitarian exceptions of letting medicines in, but functionally it just doesn't work that way. So we know for a fact that Iran has been under these really stringent sanctions for years now, and it leads to people not being able to access, like cancer drugs. So this is already a thing that we do. We already do this very anti-humanitarian thing, but people were just very shocked that this like supposedly liberal guy basically is coming out and saying this, especially maybe liberal people who don't know as much about the sanctions regime. I mean, quite famously, I think Madeleine Albright said in an interview, we had been sanctioning Iraq since 1990. This was before the Second Gulf War. She was asked, these sanctions are estimated to have killed over 500,000 children in Iraq. Was it worth it? And she was like, yeah, it was worth it. Like, I think the way she said it was like, well, the cost was steep, but it's like the price you have to pay. So this isn't anything new, but I think it's a really good window into the way that the U.S. wields power against civilians. And it's just consistently done all the time. And I think what's interesting about this moment is that we're sort of seeing things that already existed, but we're seeing how brutal they actually are. So, for example, everyone's kind of like, well, why would the COVID vaccine cost money? Because we need everyone to get vaccinated. That's going to be good for everybody. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of like all healthcare. Like, why would any of the healthcare cost money if we're going to have a healthier community that's going to cost less in the long term, which has been demonstrated over and over and over again. So this is the same sort of situation of like, ooh, wouldn't it be really like fucked up if we just didn't give children a vaccine because like their leaders were our geopolitical rivals? Yes, it would be, and yes, we already do.
And I hope it will become part of messaging where it's like, remember when we did that for COVID, diabetes is COVID.
I think this is like really ripe for messaging, and I think it's really underutilized because again, people like don't understand very much about how the U.S. wields power in the world, because it's really, really crucial to both Democrats and Republicans to see ourselves again as a sort of spreader of democracy. We're these wonderful people who just want good things for everyone in the world. So even just acknowledging U.S. power is something that's not really done on either side of the aisle. The only way that we talk about power is about, protecting ourselves. We're doing it defensively, and also, stopping the bad guys. So there's no conversation around what else we do in the world. and how we administer
Well, there
the
will
American
be
Empire.
a conversation happening tonight, just in about 30 minutes on our segment later. But I would invite either Ludovico or Ellie Mae O'Hagan if you want to weigh in on how vaccine diplomacy is coming from your spots in the world. And I would say, I think by far the best vaccine diplomat I've seen is the Sputnik Twitter handle. I think they do a really lively, good job. They're out there tweeting. You never hear from AstraZeneca. You don't hear from Johnson & Johnson. You hear regularly from Sputnik. I think they're doing a good job. I'm talking about the Twitter handle. I have no idea how the vaccine is doing.
I didn't
That's the
catch the
important
question because you cut out.
No, just, how vaccine diplomacy is going from the UK. We see in America there's a debate going on about it. How is it being used as soft power in the UK or in Italy?
It really isn't here. It's quite disappointing. Really,
Not even with
how,
with Commonwealth nations?
No, it's like every now and then you'll get like the third story down on the the news. A lot of news websites have like a COVID section, and every now and then it'll be like the third story down. It'll be like UK urged to give vaccines to developing nations, but like it really isn't like a big. There is a campaign by an organisation called Just Treatment, but it really isn't a big part of the conversation here. And I think like part of that is because we have really put our eggs in the vaccine basket in this country. And so I think there's like this sense of like we can't give them away until like there's not much public support for it at the moment because people are like desperate to have a vaccine. So they opened like Twickenham Stadium the other day to do like a mass vaccination, and there was like mile-long queues within like minutes. People are like desperate to be vaccinated. So I think because there really is no other defence against COVID in this country because the government just doesn't care about that. And we are looking at a potential third wave now. So yeah, and I think that will maybe those stories will start to get more attention. And like vaccine diplomacy will start to get more attention once our rollout has been completed. But now the emphasis here is on vaccinating as many people in this country as possible, and like whether that will be able to stop a third wave.
In Italy, we're bounded by the European vaccination plan, actually, since we decided to have a not very effective, to be frank, but a European distribution plan to the member countries, and therefore we will follow that. The two interesting things are, I think, number one is that actually we exported a lot of vaccines. But to whom? To the US and to the UK. Because it wasn't the government that actually exported them as a tool of soft power, but it was the vaccination company that produced a lot of vaccine, and the EU didn't stop them. Because the opposite happened from the US. In my opinion, it's not even cynical, the US vaccine diplomacy policy. It's a bit dumb because someone else is going to export them. You don't give vaccine to Venezuela, to Iran. That's fine. China will. China already did. China is also using vaccination to places that are traditionally very aligned to the US. In Chile, the majority of Chileans are vaccinated with the Sinopharm vaccines because the US decided to do this very nationalistic, which again can be right or wrong, depend from where you see it, policy in saying we do not allow any exportation of vaccine, we do not even allow the big pharma companies to sell any vaccine outside the US, we're going to keep it only from our population. And on one end, you have one of the best vaccination rate on the world. On the other end, you have other geopolitical actors such as Russia and China in particular who fill the void and already shipped out hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines into countries that were willing to receive them and to be grateful to them for it. And it will just keep going. Like they will keep filling this void if the US want to leave it open.
The last thing I want to touch on before we go on this fine evening, I guess it's morning for you, Julia, is something we had happen in the U.S. that I think I want to know if it actually went across or not. But we had the Senate parliamentarian. Is this extremely random person whose job it is to interpret the Senate rules. Sort of came out bizarrely, I would say, in saying that Democrats are only allowed to use a certain procedure once or twice, not even specifically, just sort of, you're not allowed to do this all the time or whatever. And because of this, Democrats are now significantly scaling back the things that they were thinking about putting into the infrastructure bill. Julia, have you been following this? Has this made it over to Europe? I mean, to me, it seems like absolute, people's general reaction is, who is this person? Who cares what they think? I mean, it seems like sort of a weird excuse.
Are you talking about the budget reconciliation
the Senate
process?
Parliamentarian says they can only anyway, go ahead. You.
Well, so budget reconciliation, they can only do it in 3. That was already a rule that they can only use it 3 times, but now they want to limit it even further and say, well, you can't use it for all of this stuff that we wanted to use it for generally. I mean, again, this just goes back to the Democrats being unwilling to understand the way power works in the world and in our country, which is that people take the power that they're able to take. With the Republicans, there's just never any hesitation. What they're doing right now is that all over the country, they're putting into place even more onerous voter restriction laws in hopes of continuing to hold on to the seats they have, as well as to potentially turn more seats by disenfranchising people. So there's no commitment to democracy on that side. One thing that drives me totally crazy is that we have these ongoing conversations about, our democracy is under threat. Our democracy is under threat. We've never really had a true free democratic process, not from our founding, not up until today. We have never had a country where people of all backgrounds can freely vote. And right now, because of the amount of money that flows into politics, we have this huge overrepresentation of corporate interests versus what people actually like. If you look at the polling of what do people actually want, it has no relationship to what actually happens in our government, which to me says that's not a democratic process. So, I just think there's always going to be limitations that the opponents of change are trying to put on the work that we're doing. And the Democrats just didn't come to fight. They're not here to fight. They're basically just doing what they always do, which is show up, be a wet noodle, and go home because someone's saying no.
It's maddeningly one-sided, right? It's only used in one direction. I guess I'm wondering if Labor or the Partito Democratico, are they also often befuddled, or at least publicly befuddled by procedural points? I mean, it seems to me like Renzi's very good at using procedural points to do all kinds of insane things in the Italian parliament. But I just sort of don't see a center-left party sort of blaming the rule book as much as I do Democrats. Talk me down.
I think in Britain, that's all they talk about. All of their... It's what happens when you have a lawyer as a leader. All of their demands are, technical. So at the moment, they're, and procedural. So at the moment, their big thing is, we need to have a COVID inquiry to see what went wrong. So, I would say that most of Labour's demands have been technical and not visionary. And, that even, extends to things like the nurses' pay rise. The public wanted them to have a 15% pay rise, and Labour backed 2% because it was what the government had originally offered. So there was a technical reason to back. There was a reason to back that. As opposed to backing 15%, which would be a kind of moral ideological case. So I would say that at the moment, the Labour Party, it doesn't get befuddled by constitutional issues because we decided to make a country without writing anything down. So we don't really have one of those. But it does get befuddled by if anything, it's sort of over-reliant on technical procedural demands in place of like an actual vision.
Well, in Italy, I mean, the constitution is fairly detailed compared to the US ones, so we don't have
You got a nice
constitutional,
one.
nor procedure. I mean, we do have some procedural issues, but usually they are always political issues that can somehow be resolved through some deals or through a shifting of the power balance. But the PD, the Democratic Party in Italy, often suffer from what Ellie was also mentioning, that we will always be compliant with the technical details, especially regarding to Europe. If Europe asks us not to do too much deficit, or if we have to respect, like PD has always been the party of responsibility. Even when nobody else is respecting it, no other government would follow it. The opposition and the right wing do not care at all about this and will disregard it completely at any moment. But PD has kind of always had and was weighed down in some point by being the party of responsibility, which also means that every time we put forward proposals, they have to be fully costed, they have to be very well structured, otherwise people will start attacking us and say, oh, now you're like the populist, now you're like... So we try to always be responsible and institutionalist, even when it hurts us.
Yeah. I think you put it right. That's what I don't like. I don't like the responsibility and respectability of it all. I guess that's what bothers me about kind of hiding behind the rules.
I mean, and I also just think it's not coincidental. Like, in other words, I don't actually think this is happening because
No, they're looking
Democrats
for
just
a desk to
love
hide
rules
behind.
so much. I think they're looking for that sort of controlled opposition middle ground of like, we want to make changes, but like not too
we can get you half
change. I mean, Biden also just basically said he's going to preserve some of the Trump corporate tax breaks because Republicans wanted him to. So,
well, all right, Ellie, Julia, Ludovico, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope that we can talk to you all next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, Jack said your hair looks better than mine, and I think that's fine, because that's not what I'm worried about right now. What I'm worried about is that Fiamma is running around telling people that all of my followers, and that means your followers as well for the show, are bots, and it's not true. It's like a liberal lie. I feel like it's 2016 again.
You're claiming that you have real friends in real life?
I'm claiming I have real friends in real life. Yes, I'm claiming that, and I'm claiming that some of them are even friends with me on the social media. That's what I'm claiming.
I'm just not sure that's going to hold up in court.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Comite, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, corul, comite, we young way, submiti, we committee.
Hi, and welcome to your Global News Rodeo. That's our roundup we do every week, curated by Forrest, Lovette, show producer, and we try to give you a quick rundown of what's going on around the world. It's usually a couple days out of date, you may have noticed, because we record it on Friday and post on Monday. Here we go. Item 1, Bye-Bye Bibi. Israel forms opposition coalition. Al Jazeera reports that Yair Lapid, the Israeli opposition leader, has formed a new coalition which will oust current President Benjamin Netanyahu. Lapid, a former TV presenter and centrist, found his needed support from multimillionaire and religious nationalist Naftali Bennett. Their agreement would see both men rotating in the role of prime minister. Among the coalition's 8 parties, one is United Arab List, who represents Palestinian citizens living in Israel. This marks the first time in Israeli history that a pro-Palestinian party has been included in the government alliance. Netanyahu has served as prime minister since 2009 and faces a trial with criminal charges of bribery, breach of trust, and fraud. And I would go on to say that this sort of Frankenstein of a coalition that's been put together to oust Netanyahu may end up being a cure that is worse than a disease. There are a lot of unpleasant characters in it, especially in places like defense where it really matters. So there's a smattering of left-wing hope in there, but I don't know, we're going to have to see. Item 2, austerity, no thanks. Nigerian workers strike. Last Monday saw the beginning of an enormous 5-day strike in the Nigerian state of Kaduna. The Socialist Worker reports that the assembly was a warning strike organized by the Nigeria Labour Congress after the state government sacked 4,000 workers. Thousands took to the streets in solidarity, despite threats made from Governor El-Rufai, who has a long track record of anti-labor and neoliberal policies dating back to the late 90s. With an unemployment rate around 45%, the state government blamed the firings on declining revenue. Despite the warning strikes, there is no indication jobs will be given back, and a threat of jail time has been issued for any demonstrators. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Item 3, share the health. U.S. to distribute vaccine stockpile. Politico is reporting the Biden administration has announced their plan to send the first 25 million doses overseas. Nearly 75% of the doses will be bought through COVAX, the Global Vaccine Aid Program. The decision comes after a heated debate between officials in the White House, U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and the State Department. Among the debated topics were the questions of where to send the surplus first and how many doses should be sent. Originally, the focus was on Nepal and the Philippines, but now it has recently shifted to South America and other countries in the Northern Hemisphere. Coupled with global pressure of humanitarian response, U.S. officials are also worried that Russia and China are utilizing their own vaccines to gain political concessions. I would say some of our Democratic lawmakers, like Ted Lieu, actually were pushing for giving our allies vaccines first. We have to let the science dictate this. We are never, ever going to be out of this pandemic unless we actually quash it the right way the first time. So let's do it. Item 4, Viva la Pride. NPR reports Mexico's midterm elections had over 100 LGBTQ community members participating. The elections for the 500 seats of the lower chamber of Congress took place on Sunday. According to an official with the National Electoral Institute, this is the largest number of LGBTQ candidates in history. The first openly gay federal congresswoman, Patria Jimenez, said the massive turnout this year is social evolution. Pro-LGBTQ parties such as Citizen Movement, Democratic Illusion, and Progressive Social Networks all exceeded their quotas to be on the ballot. Citizen Movement alone registered 51 gays, 26 lesbians, 16 transgender candidates, and 4 bisexual women. Item 5, forget about it. Hong Kong activist arrested. Deutsche Welle is reporting that Chow Hang Tong, Hong Kong lawyer and activist, has been arrested. Chow was arrested Friday morning at her office by Hong Kong authorities, the vice chair of the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China. Chow was charged with unlawful assembly after holding a vigil for the infamous and deadly Tiananmen Square incident. The past 2 anniversaries of the 1989 massacre have been banned due to the pandemic, but for the past 30 years, huge crowds have gathered in Hong Kong in remembrance, enjoying liberties which are forbidden in mainland China. Chow has called upon others to continue the vigil without her, telling them to light candles in their homes and post commemorations on social media. Item 6, loud and clear. Majority Brazilians want their country back. Last week saw tens of thousands of protesters flock to the streets in Brazil calling for President Bolsonaro's impeachment. The Guardian reports that demonstrators turned up in more than 200 cities to protest against the catastrophic response to the coronavirus pandemic, which has killed nearly 500,000 people in Brazil. The anti-Bolsonaro mobilizations are the biggest since the pandemic began. One poll by POTR says that 57% now support the president's impeachment. An activist from Brazil's Unified Black Movement commented on the demonstration saying, "Today is a decisive milestone in the battle to defeat Bolsonaro's genocidal administration." Can you hear me at all? If I was a human, would you be able to hear me? Is this some kind of you're pretending I'm a robot thing? Because I don't know who put you up to this, if it was Julie or Fiamma or whoever. But if this is some sort of ignore the robot joke, then I don't think it's funny. All right? These are people. These are people. Hi, welcome to Deep Cuts, where we get a chance to talk to a smart person about a specific subject and take it that extra mile. The show's own Julia Doubleday has once again selected an amazing author and book. Can you tell us what's on tap?
Yeah, thank you so much, Arun, and thank you all for joining us today on the committee program. Today we are talking with historian, journalist, and commentator Vijay Prashad. He is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the chief editor of Leftward Books. We're talking to him today about his fantastic book, Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA, Coups, and Assassinations. So thank you so much for being here today, Vijay.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
And I just want to say, I had a book that was slightly similar that I read when I was 15 or 16 called Counter-Revolution. And it was happening at the same time as I was maybe being programmed in class. This was the thing deprogramming me. And it really affected my life. And so when Julia brought up your book and mentioned it, I just wanted to say, there are young people who you put together such an amazing compendium of information are going to be picking this up for the first time and learning things about how America expresses power for the first time. And I just think it's a real achievement and something that's amazing. And what made you decide to do it?
Right. So thanks for that. That's great. There's several, no book has a single trajectory, and particularly nothing of this kind, at least for me. So I'll tell you both stories, if that's okay. The first story goes back to many years ago. I had a very fantastic encounter with Eduardo Galeano, who, I'd asked Galeano, how is it that you are able to write such beautiful prose about such horrible things like torture and dictatorships and so on, And he said, well, look, there's no point in prose repeating the torture. There's no point, because that just sort of will traumatize people. There's no point doing that. Is there a way to write about something very ugly by keeping the hope intact, by keeping humanity intact? That was advice that I really took to heart. And that also made me think about the fact that readers have to be able to read a book. There's a lot of conversation now, and I'm sorry, I'm beginning with form and not content, but this comes to the point. But people say, people don't read, and people say, well, young people don't read and so on. And I actually think that's an unfortunate way to formulate things. The issue isn't that people don't read, it's how do they read, what do they read, and so on. So I decided I wanted to write a book like this, almost like a series of Facebook posts. Each section is short. You can read the section, shut the book, come back to it a week later if you'd like, depending on, the level of your precarious work. You're busy, you're, distracted by a million things. So read a bit, put it away. The problem with writing long chapters with a sustained argument is it requires a kind of dedication, time, discipline, and so on, which people may not have. So I had the idea of the form very much at the center of my mind. Then there was this coup against Evo Morales Ayma in Bolivia in November of 2019, and that coup, of course, bothered me. Evo Morales is a terrific person. 14 years he's run a government, improved the conditions of life of people in Bolivia. But what really bothered me was the liberal and to some extent left liberal consensus that Morales had been there too long, that he should go, and whatever. And this is striking to me because Angela Merkel has been the Chancellor of Germany longer than Evo Morales. So you have an indigenous man who's the president of a country, and you can so easily disparage him. Nobody says this about Ms. Merkel. She can be the Chancellor. In fact, now in Germany, a lot of people suggest let her continue. The alternatives are really bad. Let her go. So it's okay for her to have, 16, 18, 19 years, but for him to have more than 14 out of the question, I found that objectionable. Lots of
sensitive people saying it's not a coup, it's not a coup, it's just, he overstayed his welcome, stuff like that. And I thought, wow, an entire generation doesn't see what's happening to Evo. They don't see what happened to Manuel Zelaya in Honduras as a coup. They don't even see what happened to Hatoyama as a coup, what happened in Japan in 2009. These things are just not available, the grammar. So I thought, okay, I spent, I think, a few weeks in January, feverish. I know this material very well. I've been a reporter long enough. I've talked to intelligence people for years. I understand this stuff. So I sat down for a few weeks in January and I just wrote this flat. It was there. And I knew that the best example is Guatemala. And the book, the center of the book is Guatemala. The best example is Guatemala. And that's because the US government has actually told us what it did. Now, okay, that's a methodological point. Maybe they lied in their after action report. But if they lied in order to make a point I wanted to make. So I thought, well, let's just use their material. As much as possible, let's use the US government materials to explain what the US government has said and done. Or, British government materials, other intelligence agencies. This is not a book where I've gone and done a lot of field reporting, It's basically intelligence officials, it's intelligence material, and I've essentially said, look, this is what they said they've been up to. So why don't we take them seriously? That's the book.
I think we can definitely draw this direct line between Arbenz in Guatemala and then what happened in 2019 in Bolivia. And what's interesting is the way the sort of media apologies for these actions, they don't really change shape over time. So I think we've seen this same playbook repeated over and over and over again, but we treat each case as if it's this individual case and we've never seen anything like it before. This is just about protecting democracy. Even though we can go back and historically we see, okay, yeah, this was the CIA and they were involved in overthrowing this person and they were involved in fomenting dissatisfaction and they were involved in the sort of economic sanctions that lead to a crisis situation on the ground. So on this show, we've talked a little bit about, how coups are constructed, but I was hoping you could speak to, from Guatemala to Bolivia, what are the ingredients that go into creating this ripe environment for a coup? Because I think one thing that's really misunderstood in the public is that they think a coup is going to be called a coup and they're going to know it's a coup. And if there's any room for doubt, then maybe it's not a coup. So how do we identify these things as they're unfolding? What are the signs that it's happening?
Well, that's interesting. And so there's a reason in the center, the heart of the book I've put together is a manual of regime change. And the manual has several components in it, including, and I emphasize this a lot, these two aspects, one of information warfare, and the other one is getting the institutional actors prepared and ready. There's a lot of preparation that goes into making a coup. So let me talk about this first, and then I'll talk about a legislative coup, because that's slightly different. It's a lot of preparation. You got to have an ambassador on the ground who really understands power and is not afraid to exercise it. And the United States has had the capacity to train people to be superb ambassadors. I mean, it's a rogues gallery of thugs, you can't blink. You really have to be tough, and you just can't care about the consequences. Ride roughshod over democracy, over some, campesino leader or whatever, some students in Thailand, if they're all going to die, you just have to have that fortitude, to hold the course. So having the ambassador in station is very important. The ambassador working closely with the CIA and so on. We used to tell an old joke, why can't there be a coup in the United States? Well, they can't, because there's no US embassy there. And, you have, meanwhile, the center of intrigue in so many countries is the United States embassy. That is a very important institutional focus. They have to have a liaison with the military. You got to get enough people in the military sold to the idea that the government, the mostly left-wing government in power, is a threat to the traditional order. Look, in Chile in 1970, that's when Salvador Allende wins an election. It's a slim margin, but he wins the election. They assassinated. The United States government colludes in the assassination of a general who was against the coup d'etat. That's 3 years before the actual coup is held. They go to that length to prepare the terrain for the military to be ready to act. It's important because, listen, it's not clear that militaries would like to act. Often militaries can be quite committed to a constitution. They are against acting in this way. So you have to prepare them. You have to get them ready, and that takes work. For that, you often bring them to, some military universities in the United States. They might come to the School of the Americas, for instance. They might come and train at West Point. They might get a degree at Harvard. So you bring these mid-career military people from the militaries in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and they come, they're flattered, they write master's degrees, at Stanford University. Then they go back with their master's degree from Stanford will get them promoted. So they accelerate to becoming, people who command forces. You don't want them necessarily to be generals. You need to have people who can command, particularly in the capital city, who command the main garrisons. They are very important. So there's that connection that's made with the military. These are the institutional supports. Then there's an information war. You delegitimize the government. You start spreading all kinds of stories, and face it, any government has stories that could be made against them. You either delegitimize the leader personally, their family members, or whatever it is. Information wars happen all the time. But then linked to that is you can start doing sanctions policies, economic warfare that raise the social crisis in the country. If you don't allow, for instance, a country to borrow. Richard Nixon famously tells Henry Kissinger about Chile again, we'll make the economy scream. We won't allow the government of Allende to access credit. If they can't access credit, their borrowing is going to be higher, more expensive. There'll be inflation in the country. If there's inflation, living standards will decrease. If living standards decrease, people will be now open to the propaganda. If you tell them, look, he's eating lobster in his palace while you are starving, people come out angry. The military moves. People thank the military for moving. So there's a way in which the coup has to be produced. It takes a lot of preparation. It's a theater. It's theatrical. The day of the coup is the opening day of the play. All the elements have to be ready. All the actors have to learn their lines. They have to hit their mark. When you go to see a play, you don't want that silence. You want the actor to come onto stage right when the cue is called for. They must enter. They must say, what's happening, dear? Did you miss me? If they miss their cue, there's silence. So every actor has to be prepared to enter the stage at the correct time. That choreography is often done by the CIA person on the ground or the ambassador. Now, I've talked to lots of CIA people who have had direct access to either this information or participated in a coup. And they'll tell you, it's not so complicated. Chuck Cogan, who was the head of Directorate of Operations for the Middle East for many years, used to tell me at great length about the stuff they did. It's not so difficult because you have the whole weight of US institutional power behind you. It's not so complicated. Look, coups are not done by the government of Burkina Faso is not conducting a coup against Mali. It's the government of France and the government of the United States. So there's enormous institutional power. You got to face that. When we talk about coups, they're not happening, like this. Now, just to finish this point, there are coups that come from below. The attempted coup by Hugo Chavez in 1992, for instance, it's a coup that failed. These are coups that come from the working class members of the military. We saw that in Egypt, for instance, the coup d'etat of the free officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Those are different. I wrote a book called Darker Nations where I differentiated between the generals' coups and the colonels' coups. It was just a silly way of saying the coups from above, a coup sanctified by the oligarchies, a coup sanctified by, the United States or other formerly colonial countries, France and so on, and then the coup from below. These coups from below sometimes are about salaries. Low-level officers are angry that they haven't received a raise, they do a coup. So you do see coups from below that are not exactly like the coup from above. But this book is mainly focused on the coup from
What
above.
what's your take on what's happened since 2019 in Bolivia? Is the fact that Janina Nez is now under arrest, does that indicate that, our power abroad to dictate the, governments of other countries, is that an indication that our power is waning in some ways? It seems like the press really doesn't know how to respond to what has happened since 2019, almost because the playbook runs out. Like the usual playbook is, okay, Morales is gone and then that's it. And now this interim government's in power and maybe it'll be there for 20 years and we don't have to think about it anymore. And now, we've come back. Evo's party is back in power, and it's sort of like they don't want to totally acknowledge there was a coup, but they're kind of just almost trying to sweep it under the rug at this point. So what's your take on that turn of events?
It's an excellent question. So let's compare Bolivia to Honduras, because these are opposite comparisons. Honduras, after the coup, and it's a coup government that remains in power, even though there have been elections. It's a coup government. There have been massacres, of anybody putting their head above water, criticizing the government. The killing of Berta Cáceres, for instance, the very prominent activist of the Lenca people against the building of dams, then the disappearance of Garifuna leaders and so on. Honduras has seen terrible violence, the intimidation of trade unionists and so on. So you can actually succeed. I don't want to use the Bolivia case to say, well, this is a demonstration of the weakening of US power. That would be too much. It puts too much on the Bolivian people. So there are many instances in the world, Julia, where United States power quite successfully maintains the oligarchies in control. And by the way, Honduras, the president of Honduras, Mr. Hernandez, his brother is an indicted narco trafficker in US courts. And in the filing in the US courts, they say that his brother helped finance President Hernandez's run for office. So here's a narco trafficker in power, but he's pro-US, so it's all okay. Don't look there, friends. Let's look somewhere else. Let's point fingers at Venezuela or wherever. We don't want to look at Honduras. So just to put that out there, they've succeeded, and it's not me saying that his brother is a narco trafficker. It's not me saying he was financed by narco money. It's the US prosecutors who have indicted and found him guilty. Okay, this is a filing. You can read the court case in the US district courts, in New York City. I mean, you don't even need to don't take my word for any of what I'm saying. All of this stuff comes from the United States government, one level or the other, their own utterances. Bolivia, it was a grotesque miscalculation by the US ruling class, because they thought they would be able to easily intimidate the Bolivian people. And it's got to be said that Evo Morales, in 14 years, and before Evo Morales' government, the movement to socialism, MAS, came to power, from the 1990s, the protests in Cochabamba, the protests all across the country against the privatization of gas, privatization of water, decades of protests in the Cocalero movement before Evo comes to power. And then in that 14-year period, there's a great confidence in the Bolivian people. They were not going to be intimidated. That was clear. I mean, I know this because when I finished writing the book, Evo wanted to Evo wrote the preface to the book. I keep forgetting that. Did he write the preface or the forward? I keep forgetting that. I think preface is written by the author, forward is written by somebody else, whatever it is. He wrote the forward to the book. And in the forward, he writes the people are going to triumph. He was confident. Even when he left the country, went to Mexico, then Argentina, he was confident. And they were so confident that they were going to triumph that the coup regime delayed the elections for an entire year. They hid behind the pandemic, but that wasn't the reason. Mrs. Áñez, in fact, had to take herself out of the race because she was polling in the single digits. She couldn't even get the fascists to back her. They ran their own candidate, And then Luis Arce and David Chocohenca just triumphed at the polls. Why did they triumph at the polls? Because the people know that the MAS is the legitimate voice of Bolivia, not these jokers, these fascists, these actual fascists. I don't use this word loosely. These are the children of Klaus Barbie, who comes there from Nazi Germany, brings the techniques of Nazi Germany, sets up the intelligence services in Bolivia and so on. The fascistic groups led by people like Camacho and all that, they wear insignia that resembles the old fascists. So, Bolivia is a particular story. It's a little bit like Venezuela. It's been impossible for the US to, in Bolivia, there was a coup, and then the coup was reversed by the people. In Venezuela, the US just can't do a coup. The United States has been trying to overthrow the
we've been trying.
Pardon? Since 1999, the US has been trying a coup there. 2002, there was a formal coup attempt. Just can't succeed. So there are some countries where there's mass mobilization. Cuba is another one, where the United States just doesn't succeed. But we should not mistake that for a weakening of US power, because I think that's an error. I think, yes, there are places where the United States doesn't succeed, but that should not mean, therefore, that US power is weakened.
Right. There was one part in your book where, just now we were talking about, well, there's so many young people that don't really understand this history of the amount of interference the U.S. has done around the world and continues to do through various methods, neocolonial methods, international bodies like the IMF. I guess to me, that's really, it's not accidental. It's very deliberate. And at one point you refer to sort of corporate media as these sort of stenographers of power. One thing I was interested in getting your take on is, Russiagate was this huge thing in the U.S. media throughout all of Trump's presidency about how, Russia is just this totally rogue state that's doing something that's never been done in modern times, which is intervening in someone's democracy. And for me, that whole story, it turned me off so much. Like, it was so ahistorical the way it was reported. It wasn't so much the fact that we were talking about Russian interference that was really disturbing to me. It was the way that, like, the New York Times did a huge spread that was like, this is just in contravention to every norm of international behavior. And for the New York Times to say that, which is this like very respected outlet, and to not mention 50, 60, 70 years of extreme intervention and assassinations and coups that the U.S. participates in, obviously, this is something that's done deliberately. So can you speak a little bit to, the sort of hegemony of corporate media, how we challenge that, how we help people understand what America has been doing, and your take also on this, the Russiagate reporting specifically?
Yeah, so I find this story is very interesting, because you're right, Julia. You put it very well, that there was something odd about this Russiagate thing. And by the way, I don't respect the New York Times at all. But I understand what you mean, that it's respected out there. I don't respect them. The reporting around the U.S. invasion of Iraq, they've never really come clean about that. And then the very writer who wrote those stories, what's his name? Michael Gordon, I think his name is, who had shared a byline with Judy Miller at the time, is now writing stories about Wuhan Institute of Virology and the so-called, bioweapon created there, the coronavirus. It's the same guy.
There's no consequences.
Wow,
as long as you're sort of aligned with the political interests of the oligarchical class, they're not going to ever replace you. They're just going to keep letting you do your thing.
And do the same kind of thing. That's the other thing. Move them to the sports page. Well, they don't really have a sports page, but move them to the comics. Well, that's the front page. In terms of interference, let me tell you a story that people may not know. In Japan, there's a huge island called Okinawa, south of Japan, which is really, it's an enormous landmass. Almost the whole island is a US military base and has been a base for decades. There's been sustained protest from the Okinawan people because they feel colonized by this base. There are routine stories of rape by US military personnel of young Okinawans, terrible violence visited upon them, and so on. And so there's been this long attempt by the people of Okinawa to remove the US base. In 2007 and 8, this picked up. There was a lot of popular support in Japan for the end to the US base at Okinawa. A lot of support inside Japan. And so Mr. Hatoyama comes to power on a liberal ticket, but he promises to consider not expanding the US base in Okinawa. That's the first thing. And secondly, perhaps rolling it back. He actually doesn't come out fully and say, let's get rid of the US base there. He says, no expansion, and let's dial it back, and then let's also consider the rules. Like, look, I was once in a movie, in a mall, going to see a movie in Seoul, South Korea, and there were US personnel in the mall armed. I mean, imagine, you're sitting in Washington, D.C. Imagine if there was people from the People's Liberation Army of China roaming around a mall in Washington, D.C. with guns. You would be like, what's going on? But it seems perfectly normal in Japan, in South Korea, to have armed US personnel roaming around civilian areas. In Seoul, the big US base, is right in the heart of Seoul. So the point is that Hatoyama wins the election, comes to power, starts a modest agenda. Again, it's really Arbenz level reform. Jacob Arbenz of Guatemala was a modest left liberal who wanted to do agrarian reform in his Guatemala. He was overthrown largely by United Fruit Company. But in this case, Hatoyama said, let's talk about the base and so on. Obama and Hillary Clinton were in charge. Obama was the president, Hillary Clinton Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton makes noises saying this is outrageous, can't be done. Obama goes to Japan, refuses to meet Hatoyama, in fact, refuses to come to the state dinner. They put an immense amount of pressure. They go and talk to other opposition politicians and so on. There is a vote in the parliament and he's overthrown. Now, is that a coup? Is that a coup? What is that a coup against? A man wins the election, his party wins the election on a mandate of removing a base. The United States interferes in Japanese domestic politics all the way down to the point where the prime minister has to resign. Nobody in the United States talks about interference in Japan's domestic internal affairs. There's no US gate, nothing. It's totally normal. Yeah. And in fact, if I say this to people, they'll laugh and say, "What are you talking about? Never even heard of this." It's hard. Imagine now. Imagine if the Russian government said, we are going to interfere in a congressional election. Putin is going to come to the United States. So why Putin? Sergei Lavrov is going to come to this district in Connecticut and is going to meet the people and is going to give a speech and say that this fellow running is a bozo. You can't bring him back. We want this other one to win. Would that be even allowed? Would Sergei Lavrov even be allowed to come into the country and behave like that? Not a chance. No. Not a chance. Whereas it's acceptable for Hillary Clinton to almost directly call for his overthrow, although they don't. You see, they are sophisticated. Japan is supposed to be an ally, so they don't. Look, the US government it has a long record of interfering with its allies. Look at the revelations now come from a Danish newspaper about routine US interference by spying on European countries, including, once again, by the way, it's hardly a secret, Edward Snowden revealed this in 2013, that the US government was spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone. Now there's revelations spying on the French, spying on the Germans and so on. So isn't this interference? Isn't this interference? It's political interference. There's a long history. I detailed the elections of the 1950s in Germany, in France, in Greece, in other countries where the United States paid money to the Christian Democrats to defeat the left. This is on the record. Again, just to be clear to people, most of this is written out of the CIA's own declassified documents, okay? This is not me talking to some disgruntled politician in Italy. This comes right out of CIA declassified documents. Right. This comes out of conversations with the CIA.
Right. Yeah, I always wonder, in terms of Russiagate, I always wonder, what do people think the CIA does? We have this entire massive intelligence body that's focused on the governments of other countries and spying on them and changing them at will. And it's just, I don't know what people think the CIA does if it's not interfering in elections, because that's the main thing that they do. We have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to ask a last question about some other means through which we exercise power that aren't direct coups. In the book, you talk about how as we get into the 70s and 80s, the IMF has a lot of power over developing economies. They insist on the institution of structural adjustment programs in order to receive loans from the IMF. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. And then if you could also wrap it up with a discussion of the NGOization of public duties. In other words, like, in the last few decades, we've seen as these governments are shrinking under the neoliberal economic world order, we have NGOs rushing in to fill that space. And how does that also affect power in those countries and affect what the government can and can't do?
It's a great question. Some years ago, after he resigned from being the finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis said that, nowadays to make a coup, you don't need tanks when you have banks. And I think that's a very clear statement, because from the 1970s, particularly after the so-called Volcker shock, when the US raised interest rates and really sent the public finances of most countries that had borrowed in dollars into a real tiz, and that's what created the third world debt crisis. From that point, international institutions, basically controlled by the US Treasury Department, could come in with enormous leverage to demand things, because these countries needed IMF assistance, World Bank assistance, and so on, and that gave leverage. This is what Thomas Sankara, for instance, constantly warned against, and then he was assassinated in 1987. During this period, Fidel Castro tried to create an international debt strike. Countries around the world stopped paying debt servicing. Amazing political initiatives, didn't go anywhere. Countries were weakened. And as they were weakened, as they allowed the IMF to come in and dictate policy. Now talk about interference, to dictate policy. Your own citizens don't have the right to drive your economic policy. The International Monetary Fund staff mission comes in and they tell you what to do, how much you should spend on education, healthcare, and so on. So the more you privatize of social welfare, the more you privatize in terms of human life, you open that space to the private sector for profit on the one side, and secondly for philanthropy on the other. Now this philanthropy business is interesting. In the book I get into the Haiti story, where you see mainly US-backed philanthropies come in, many of them actually funded by the US government. That's the other interesting story. People don't realize many NGOs, international NGOs funded by the US government. And listen to this, in Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the Americas, the United States government and the NGOs, US-funded NGOs, fought against the rise of a minimum wage in Haiti. They fought against the rise of a minimum wage in Haiti. I mean, people should be embarrassed to hold US passports, frankly. You should be embarrassed to hold a US passport. The United States government is a gangster government. Country like Haiti suffered one crisis after the other. They had the first major revolution, of a poor country in 1804. A major revolution written about in the book Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James. Great story. That country has constantly been suffocated by the French, by the United States, so on. The fact that the Americans can, in this recent period, fight against the rise of minimum wage in Haiti is a criminal action. And that was the IMF, the US Treasury Department, and US funded NGOs. Just putting it all together, that's a form of coup d'etat, because you're basically not allowing the Haitians their own political agenda.
Right. Yeah, no, I remember hearing about that. The Haitians had actually voted for that increase, which was then rolled back. Well, Vijay, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I'd love to talk to you for another 2 hours, but we do have to wrap it up. I hope people will go out and get the book. Again, the name of it is Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA Coups and Assassinations. And hopefully we'll have you on again sometime to really unpack some more of this stuff. So thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, hey, Nomi. Yeah, we're recording the show right now. Yeah, Jamaä was great last week. In fact, no, I agree, but... No, absolutely, but... Look, I mean, we can do whatever we can do, but... Yeah, but... Yeah, well, but we can have him on right now. Hey, welcome to Going Places and Doing Things, which is a segment on the show where we talk to people, especially from a practical practitioning point of view, people who actually do things in politics, not just people reporting on it. And we have... Oh, hang on one sec. Yeah, he's here, but... Yeah, absolutely, but he doesn't have a beard. All right, we're gonna roll. I gotta go. Bye.
Oh, God.
So introducing back to the show, Jamaä Bickley-King, friend of mine, friend of the show. We're so happy to have you 2 weeks in a row. Feel blessed. Feel #blessed. But yeah, here's a different thing. We don't want to talk to you about the news. I want to talk to you about one of the things that I famously speak out against, which is the overutilization of data in our modern politics. But we were talking before we came on, and actually I think you're of the right Gen X age to sort of have entered into political data when it was a novelty, when it was more of a psychedelic experience, and now certainly we could say that it's a normal part of any campaign. And I'd love to just hear you as a person who has worked inside both big and small data, kind of how that was and how that went, and how you would advise especially smaller campaigns to think about data, right? It's a word that's thrown around to mean a zillion different things. Let's just start with what you think it is.
Yeah, I've been in political data for about 20 years now, and unlike most people in our space, I came through it classically trained out of engineering, where you had a lot of data technology coding, and so I had a knowledge base where I was technical first, and then I came to politics. But I had my root in the field engagement and the voter engagements over the doors. I was that was drilled into me early on. It's like you talk to people at the doors, you make human connections, you go out from there, you build critical mass, and that's how you win. And I always embodied that as I moved up forward, as our spaces kind of steadily evolved from the early days where data and technology was this novelty that you're an optional extra, to like real sophistication in building out organization models that center the data and technology as they go door to door. And we have gone from a moment where we used to have to depend only on community groups and engaging with certain stakeholders, ward boss systems based off of the Chicago model and some Boston, New England models of how to do engagement. And because they were getting such a diminished rate of return, they moved over to these data pieces so that they can go ahead and hold the institutional knowledge that doesn't tend to disappear year after year. And that was the initial reason why they did it. And then as we grew in more sophistication, we realized we can do more and more stuff with the data, and from that an entire industry was born. So much so that it even has, in some ways, outsized impact on elections, and that's where the tension between you and I is usually is right there.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you talk about this sort of replacing the ward models, which is certainly, a model I've openly admired on the show. Tammany Hall certainly knows how to get votes out if they don't always keep their hands out of the till. But do you think what is left behind in this new smartly targeted way? And I say that in a slightly smart-ass way, where I so often, especially in field, where I see data is using is let's make sure we're knocking on the right doors to do the right things. And sometimes I wonder if the ward mentality of we're going to knock on every single door in this block before noon isn't better. And I wonder if some of this is based on is difference between elections and re-elections. Do you know what I mean? I think like the idea of you reignite your base versus you try to persuade new people is how can data be responsive to this? These are two big questions. Sorry to throw huge ones at you.
Yeah. And no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's not so much about activating and reactivating your base. It's actually a conversation around organizing. And that is where the data piece, because so many people are now emulating it, they copy a copy. We're now maybe 5 or 6 federal cycle generations, maybe more, maybe 8 or 9, where the original, people forgot the original reason why we went to these models was to take the door knocking, knock every door model that you can get on a small local campaign, but then project it outward to a national election where that would be functionally impossible. But we can emulate that by using the data and technology so that when they knock every door that they have on their list, it is an opportunity for them to gain and accrue and keep new voters. And that was what it was built for. Now there is, because of our organizing and a lack of institutional knowledge on why we did this shit in the first place, you have people wanting to use data for shit that you shouldn't use
okay,
it for.
this is like, the real stuff we're getting
I am now running for Exactly. You're going to go into like a school board race and you're like, well, I want to know what my data model is so I can be like, no, motherfucker, you knock all the doors. You only got like 12,000 voters. You start early in the summer or late in the spring and you keep going until you've hit that community 5 or 6 times and the point where they're just tired of seeing it. You know what I'm saying? And that's what you should be doing at that level. That is something functionally impossible for a presidential. And that's where the data and technology was supposed to use to bridge the gap. But now people are so accustomed to like, I have to have a system to access all the voters, I have to have data, I have to have IDs, and I have to have some sort of analytics to go on top of that to help me so that when I'm talking to people that I'm doing the smart thing with these limited resources. But when you have that small of a universe, your number one resource is your time and your effort. And it's not so much financially, and then it gets into, well, I think it sets some candidates on the wrong path early on, where they feel like the model says I need to hit these numbers to win, I'm only going to hit those numbers. That is a mistake, especially at the smallest levels. That is to help you make decisions when your resources are limited, and you need to do the code calculation of figuring like, I can't talk to all these people. If I talk to these people, they give me the best opportunity to win with the time and resources available. And that's what it should be used for. And a lot of campaigns are not doing that, and it comes from us. It is less a conversation about like data being bad, but people not understanding how to use it correctly.
Well, how would you recommend a smaller campaign then? Let's say, I think what you're describing as being sort of useful audience probably sounds like a larger statewide presidential, as you say. But let's say someone is working on not a tiny race, a small congressional. A rural seat congressional. How would you see them layering data smartly into their field?
They would, especially if it's a rural congressional, it becomes a conversation about density and time.
Yeah, because I was thinking you can't knock everyone, right? It's like, we got all these little things. What do we? This maybe does mean we want more of a mechanized process.
Exactly. When you're doing a rural campaign, it's like, I got my truck, drive, knock on a door, get in the truck, drive some more, knock on the door, and it's like that. And the issue there is like, it's more a conversation about building strong ties to the community and leveraging those. So it's a yes and conversation. So data is not just a voter file conversation. It's also about having intelligence about critical influencers, micro influencers, macro influencers, and basically tying that together for a winning strategy to win as many of those people over so they are supporting you in your candidacy to move forward. And even if there's a moment where a macro or micro influencer is against you, it's also getting to the people they talk to mitigate the effect of that person who may be against you and take a portion, if not all of those people, and support you as well. And so that is another way. So it's about sophisticated engagement, using data, and when you have it as a data piece where you take that institutional information and turn it to hard data, then you can distribute the work away from just 1 or 4 individuals. You can farm it out. You can check and see how other people can help you and assist you. You can use other engagement tactics, like, you know, I can go to digital here, I can go to this conference here, I can go to this food fair here, and you will know the impact of your work so that you're regularly accruing votes. Like, if you come to the election and you don't have a really good idea about how you're going to do, that means you were not able to do all the engagement that you wanted to, or you did it incorrectly. Because once you get to these things, you should know the answer before night. In 2008, we knew we were doing so much canvas work in Michigan and Detroit. We knew we won the election in Michigan a week and a half before the election day, simply on the absentee ballots and early vote numbers alone. And so we were able to project from that. We knew we wanted. We didn't tell anybody in the organization that, because we wanted people to go as hard as they possibly could for as long as possibly could. But we knew that we were doing well, and there's a conversation about bringing up down ticket people and all that other shit. So if you're doing these things, you should go ahead and go there and take as much institutional knowledge as you can, conversations about getting micro and macro influencers, and this is above and beyond the voter engagement stuff, which you still should do, where you should probably go ahead into maybe a phone model to kind of cover more territory, and then supplement that with a door-to-door piece wherever possible, and then also have a map of your resources, like I have people.
Speaking of map, it sort of sounds like to me, as they're talking about the scale of a smaller campaign versus larger campaign, that you're describing as data sort of having more and more role in the sort of individual power mapping of a district that you would normally do both online and offline, and that it becomes more abstract as you get larger crowds, just necessarily because you're no longer power mapping individuals, you're power mapping groups of people. But that actually, this is the sliding scale that people should be thinking about it as.
Well, sort of. You should have a vehicle so you can go ahead and take those large communities and then put them through a process where they select into the different channels of your buckets of where they want. Supporter, persuasion, adversary. You know, it's like, you need to put it in there. Adversary, probably a little too harsh for a lot of people. But
look, sometimes you got to mark it off on the clipboard. You're like, do not come into this house. Sorry. You know, the hobos say stay away.
Exactly. It's like... Exactly. They have a shotgun, they will kill you. And so in that, because you, again, limited people unit per time, you need to go ahead and say, okay, these are my supporters. I want to keep those people in my do programs, to keep those people as I engage them through those different channels I talked about. These are people we need to persuade or can be persuaded, or it can be persuaded, and we need to go ahead and engage them as much as possible to move them, but not at the expense of the people that I'm there, and hopefully not in a way such to inflame the people against me, such that they gain equal amount of energy and momentum. That one last thing I said is something that has been lost in this current moment in politics, because people see value in that. But I think that there is a way where you can run for an office and not create equal and opposite energy against you.
I mean, that's sort of the negative ad things, right? It works, but it actually works. But you get enough splatter on you that you're going to have to work a little harder. And I think people don't always realize sort of something that's working may also be making you work harder. But let's take a different pool. Let's take an important pool, a pool that you live in, Virginia. So, you know, you are the co-founder of, or one of the founders of New Virginia Majority, which is seeking to make purple Virginia permanently blue, et cetera, et cetera. When you're looking at it from your 20 years in data, what do you think of this mission as? I think a lot of our international audience would be familiar with the fact that people have been working in Georgia for not just this cycle, but also off cycles to make something happen. This has been happening for longer in Virginia, so one assumes that there is an even more detailed blueprint that's probably somewhat different.
Yeah, and when you think about this organization and the other ones like New Georgia Project, the one Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight, there's a division of labor in the progressive movement and engagement. You have, of course, the partisan actors. They get all the accolades, the press, and everything out there. And then there's a whole strata of C4 allied entities, which are like nonprofits, NGOs, that can, by their tax status, advocate for or against candidates and issues, and then they are usually allied with one candidate or the other. And then you have underneath that a whole nother strata people who are there just to make sure certain communities are registered to vote, are protected their right to vote, and they can go ahead and do the work they can to support and empower their communities. And that's usually what they call in the C3 nonpartisan layer. But even in that conversation, they have usually more allies on one side of the political aisle than the other, but it's still totally okay for them to do that as long as they don't advocate or attack or uplift or bring down issues and candidates. And that work is usually seen as facing certain people of color, like I'm here to help make sure African Americans are okay, I'm here to make sure Latinos are okay, old people, women, children, people with diabetes, whatever you want to do, like whatever you consider your community to be, you can do that work. And in that's where in Virginia, uniquely, we have an advantage because we have off-year cycles. Our campaign finance laws are different, which allows us to do certain things, and we always have elections every year. So we are always in this campaign cycle because right now we have a gubernatorial and state legislature up, and then next year we have the federal races. After that, we have our state legislature up again, and then we have the presidential. So we're like always on. And by having so many repetitions, the people there are really, really good at what they do. And also anybody who sucks at it, we learn that very quickly, and they don't hang around here very long. And so you have now infrastructure organizations that are there to be there no matter what. And so what we're seeing now is that people are looking more at that Virginia model, and they're trying to expand it to other countries like New Georgia Project and Stacey and them. They're realizing that if we just stand up an organization on the federal cycle and it disappears on an off-year cycle and not doing work, we basically burned all the work we did previously, and you need to continue to build. And that's the story of Virginia and New Virginia Majority. We were born out of the immigration rights movement. We're largely an immigrant rights organization. We were there when it was me, John List, Marcos Villar, and Tram Nguyen. And we were out there, we were like, after it kind of blew up on us when it was like, we thought that, Ted had us. We love Uncle Ted, and we thought we were going to get it. And the whole thing went belly up. We realized that we needed to have a vehicle that is allied with those entities, but stands apart and can do its own work to build power in those communities to exist. And that was how our organization was born. And through that, we do work for the African American community, Latino community, immigrant rights community, LGBT community, student groups, AAPI community. We are there like it is developed so that any community, whether large, that is usually, underserved, we will have the ability for it to impose its will on the electorate through empowering its community and building community power and voter engagement. That is it. That's the organization. I know that's a very, simple thing, but very difficult thing to pull off. And we also do a large, formerly incarcerated organizing piece in criminal justice reform as part of our stuff because Virginia, slave state. And so in that, doing that work is that from born out of that, we were able to actually do the voter work. And through that, we have grown in sophistication and influence such so that, an organization that was literally a $60,000 grant for God Bless SCIU said, okay, we will see if you guys can do anything, is now born into a entity that has, we at times of presidential, we may have as much as 300 full and seasonal workers doing canvassing, voter engagement, and work, and around 40 to 50 full-time staff who are doing the organizing work in those communities and making sure they're empowered, everything, fair housing, low-income empowerment. So,
and marginalized communities of people come in many different flavors, but there's one who I want to surface specifically because it's an issue near and dear to my heart, and also because maybe it's trickiest in terms of what you were saying before, you don't always want to start depending on the voter file as being your Bible. What do you all do to reach out to less likely and specifically non-voters?
Yeah, and that exactly. So that is literally our model, is that when you know how the other two people in the political strata are going to, partisan people are only going to go to the likely voter or the person who is like an almost likely voter. if you're at the bottom of the voter scale, like we have a 0 to 100 likely voter scale, with 100 being you're going to vote for whatever color you like, you don't give a fuck if a comment is coming at your face, you're going to throw that switch, to 0, like literally if you have a gun to their head, they will not vote. We deal with the people who are at the 0 level, at like 0 to 15, the least likely voters, and we engage that community over and over. And that is how we've built our margins to win. That's why they're so small, but also very durable. You know, because these are people who, if we didn't go to their neighborhood year in and year out, knock on their door, say, look, you're registered to vote. You can just go vote. And here's the reasons why, because these people are doing da-da-da-da-da, and this could help your world and A, B, and C. It's actually working because after they start voting a couple of times, they now become recoded as a
more likely
as
voter,
a actual regular voter, and then the partisan actors start scooping them up and patting themselves on the back for finding that new voter that they actually got themselves. We don't dissuade them from that. We let them be happy in their bliss of ignorance. But we know we're the ones that continue to engage these voters to kind of grow the pool of possible supporters. And it also changes their politics, because the people that we're bringing in there are people who are more progressive. They're people who are more people of color. They're people who are more low income. And when you have more regular voters who are not rich, wealthy, and white, you now have to change your conversation. It's changed the conversation on local politics and criminal justice reform, so that more bars, doors, and guards is not going to get you in. You need to be more mindful of that community. We have changed the conversation around what is like a possible in terms of legalization of marijuana and around the death penalty, because our public safety conversation has always come in a conversation that any leniency will immediately have rampaging hordes of criminal minorities destroying poor rich white neighborhoods, and we all know that's total bullshit. And now that you're actually seeing a critical mass of not only people who don't want that, but people who used to be incarcerated as part of the criminal justice conversation, the politics on that has changed dramatically. And a lot of that has been the work through like getting us to give clemency to these people and getting their rights restored. Virginia has probably the most fucked up rights restoration process still in the country, because it's in their constitution that you literally have to get the governor to look at you and say, okay, I'll give you your rights back, for like literally hundreds of thousands of people. And Terry McAuliffe, to his credit, was the guy who went out there and said, fuck it, 200,000 people, give you your rights restored. The Republicans said, no, you got to do it by hand. He's like, yeah, fuck you, I want 8 auto pens, and them motherfuckers were just going. And there were just stats of those guys getting their rights that were like non-violent offenders that reached over a certain time. We just automatically doing it. And so we're trying to change that process. And this has been a long and we've had the support, of course, of Tim Kaine and Warner, and Northam is still continuing this process where we feel that, if you serve your time, you should get all your rights back, and to have it automatically taken away is bullshit. Also, because previously you could got your felony and get your rights taken away for like, I think it was like $200 or $500 of theft. So literally taking like an iPhone or some 2 designer jeans or like 3 PlayStation games, you've lost your right to vote. And that's total bullshit, and they did on purpose. And we still get pushback from the local sheriffs when we want to raise it to something reasonable like $10,000, so it's like a car or some shit, and not somebody who wanted some really nice Bose speakers that were over a ridiculous price, because it's
so
like,
can you describe some of these
bullshit.
like initial voter contacts, though, whether it be, in it, like, it seems to me that this is the hardest thing to do when you're talking to someone who you are pretty sure doesn't want to vote. Like, who from your organization do you send to have that conversation, and how do you try to formulate what that conversation is?
We make a point to hire people from those communities.
Messenger agreement, yes.
To like speak to them peer to peer in every study, in every analysis in the history of all politics, says getting from somebody from that community to talk to that community is the best way to get this done. And so we make one point to talk to the community, and also we make a point to listen to the community, which is like another part. Because people go straight to, you need to do all this shit. Like, do we know what these people want? Maybe we should ask them. And then we should try and get it to them, because they probably know better than anybody what would help them. And we do that part, and we listen to them, and we want to make it a cooperative process. And then if we get enough people there, we like to make more of them activists. We like to kind of what they call the ladder of engagement. You start out talking to them about the issues, getting them involved, and then you want them to start owning it and organizing it and give a platform. We take the next couple steps after that is like the ones that show up and are the best performers. We're like, fuck it. We're going to put you on payroll. We're going to start you at $15 an hour. Your ass going to get health care, all the stuff we fight for, and we make that happen. And then if you continue to do well, we put you on salary, and then we get you a team. And then we get you funding for your program. And then we get you to grow that team. That's how, like, a lot of the biggest success stories, in my opinion, a guy named Christopher Rashad Green, who just took this really dope job at, I think, ACLU or Poverty Law or something like that. And he was formerly incarcerated. We helped him get his rights back. He became a volunteer for us. He became an activist. He was doing such a great job. We were like, fuck it, we put him on payroll. We gave him salary. We promoted him to lead. He ran a team, and he started this really great program called Courts Watch, because in Virginia, you can't get rid of judges unless there's cause, and it has to be done by the state legislature. And so because there's no information there, we started generating our own data, and he came up with like this 88-thing survey instrument and had all these volunteers sit in the back of courtroom,
scorecard,
judging the judge on how they're doing it, so we can build. Yeah, if they start fucking up, they do it. And just their presence alone has changed how these courts operate, because there's a person judging it. The judges are nicer to the defendants. They're like, do you need some water, sir? Are you all right? Even when, you're like, fuck this guy. They don't want to kirk out on him, because they'll go down. The guy like, it just, exactly. And so it's been incredibly successful when you literally have people who, a lot of them formerly incarcerated, making judgment on the judges that were the ones that sent them there. And that's the type of power that we use, like finding people from those communities, empowering them, give them the tools they want to succeed, and then letting them, say, like, what do you want to do? And like, wow, that's an interesting idea. Let's get
Jamaä,
money for that.
Bickley-King, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about the things that you're doing and about my old boogie entity data. And look, we'll keep it going. We'll talk again soon about something, I'm sure. Oh, hi there. I had actually meant to put aside tonight's book of readings to make sure I had something for you before you all left, but was doing research on, well, actually, to be honest, the show's own Julia Doubleday has been doing a lot of research on American interventionism, and we are planning on doing a piece on the Philippines. And you know what? Instead of opening up the big book tonight, maybe we'll just dive into some of our research and read you an excerpt from that. So we have, from the introduction to How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States by Daniel Immerwahr. December 7th, 1941. Japanese planes appear over a naval base on Oahu. They drop aerial torpedoes which dive underwater, wending their way towards their targets. Bombers strike the USS Arizona, and the massive battleship heaves in the air. Steel, timber, diesel oil, and body parts fly through the air. The flaming Arizona tilts into the ocean, its crew diving into the oil-covered waters. For a country at peace, this is a violent awakening. It is, for the United States, the start of the Second World War. There aren't many historical episodes more firmly lodged in national memory than this one, the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's one of the few events that most people can put a date to, December 7th, the date which will live in infamy, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it. Hundreds of books have been written about it. The Library of Congress holds more than 350. And Hollywood has made movies, from the critically acclaimed From Here to Eternity in 1953, starring Burt Lancaster, to the critically derided Pearl Harbor in 2001, starring Ben Affleck. This was actually a very terrible movie. But what those films didn't show is what happened next. 9 hours after Japan attacked the territory of Hawaii, another set of Japanese planes came into view over another territory, the Philippines. As at Pearl Harbor, they dropped their bombs, hitting several bases to devastating effect. The Army's official history of the war judges the Philippine bombing to have been just as disastrous as the Hawaiian one. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese hobbled the United States Pacific Fleet, sinking 4 battleships and damaging 4 others. In the Philippines, the attackers laid waste to the largest concentration of U.S. warplanes outside North America, the foundation of the Allies' Pacific air defense. The United States lost more than planes. The attack on Pearl Harbor was just that, an attack. Japan's bombers struck, repeated, and never returned. Not so in the Philippines. There, the initial air raids were followed by more raids, and then by invasion and conquest. 16 million Filipinos, U.S. nationals who saluted the Stars and Stripes and looked to FDR as their commander-in-chief, fell under a foreign power. They had a very different war than the inhabitants of Hawaii did, nor did it stop there. The event familiarly known as Pearl Harbor was in fact an all-out lightning strike on the U.S. and British holdings throughout the Pacific. On a single day, the Japanese attacked the U.S. territories of Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Midway Island, and Wake Island. They also attacked the British colonies of Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and they invaded Thailand. It was a phenomenal success. Japan never conquered Hawaii, but within months, Guam, the Philippines, Wake, Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong all fell under its flag. Japan even seized the westernmost tip of Alaska, which it held for more than a year. Looking at the big picture, you start to wonder if Pearl Harbor, the name of one of the few targets Japan didn't invade, is really the best shorthand for the events of that fateful day. Pearl Harbor wasn't how people referred to the bombings, at least not at first. How to describe them, in fact, was far from clear. Should the focus be on Hawaii, the closest target to North America and the first bit of U.S. soil Japan had struck? Or should it be the Philippines, the far larger and far more vulnerable territory? Or Guam, the one that surrendered almost immediately? Or all the Pacific holdings, including the uninhabited Wake and Midway Islands together? The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves, Roosevelt said in his address to Congress in his infamous speech, but did they? The Japs bombed Manila. Hawaii was the headline of a New Mexico paper. Japanese planes bomb Honolulu. Island of Guam. Was that one in South Carolina? Sumner Welles, FDR's Undersecretary of State, described the event as an attack upon Hawaii and upon the Philippines. Eleanor Roosevelt used a similar formulation in her radio address on the night of December 7th, when she spoke of Japan bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines. That was how the first draft of FDR's speech went too. It presented the event as a bombing in Hawaii and the Philippines. Yet Roosevelt toyed with the draft all that day, adding in pencil, crossing other bits out. At one point, he deleted the prominent reference to the Philippines and settled on a different description. The attack was, in his refined version, a bombing in Oahu, or later in the speech, on the Hawaiian Islands. He still mentioned the Philippines, but only as an item on a terse list of Japan's other targets. Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, Midway, presented in that order. The list mingled U.S. and British territories together, giving no hint as to which was which. So why did Roosevelt demote the Philippines? We don't know, but it's not hard to guess. Roosevelt was trying to tell a clear story. Japan had attacked the United States, but he faced a problem. Were the Japanese targets considered the United States? Legally, yes, they were indisputably U.S. territory, but would the public see them that way? What if Roosevelt's audience didn't care that Japan had attacked the Philippines or Guam? Polls taken slightly before the attack show that few in the continental United States supported a military defense of these remote territories. Consider how similar events played out more recently. On August 7th, 1998, al-Qaeda launched simultaneous attacks on U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Hundreds died, mostly Africans, and thousands were wounded. But though these embassies were outposts of the United States, there was little public sense that the country itself had been harmed. It would take another set of simultaneous attacks 3 years later on New York City and Washington, D.C. to provoke an all-out war. An embassy is different from a territory, of course, yet a similar logic held in 1941. Roosevelt no doubt noted that the Philippines and Guam, though technically part of the United States, seemed foreign to many. Hawaii, by contrast, was more plausibly American. Though it was a territory rather than a state, it was closer to North America and significantly whiter than the others. As a result, there was a talk of statehood, whereas the Philippines was provisionally on track for independence. And yet, when it came to Hawaii, Roosevelt felt a need to massage the point. Though the territory had a substantial white population, nearly 3/4 of its inhabitants were Asians or Pacific Islanders. Roosevelt clearly worried that his audience might regard Hawaii as foreign. So on the morning of his speech, he made another edit. He changed it so the Japanese squadrons had bombed not the island of Oahu, but the American island of Oahu. Damage there, Roosevelt continued, had been done to American naval and military forces, and very many American lives had been lost. An American island, where American lives were lost, that point was the point he was trying to make. If the Philippines, being rounded down to foreign, Hawaii was being rounded up to American. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval air forces of the Empire of Japan. This is how Roosevelt's speech begins. Note that in his formation, Japan is an empire, but the United States is not. Note also the emphasis on the date. It was not only Hawaii and Midway, all of Japan's targets. The vagaries of international dateline put the event on December 7th. Everywhere else it happened on December 8th, the date that Japan used to refer to the attack. Did Roosevelt underscore the date in a calculated attempt to make it all about Hawaii? Almost certainly not. Still, his date, which will live in infamy, phrasing further, encouraged a narrow understanding of that event, and one that left little room for places like the Philippines. For Filipinos, this could be exasperating. A reporter on the scene described Manila as the crowds listened to Roosevelt's speech over the radio. The president spoke of Hawaii and the many lives lost there, yet only mentioned the Philippines, the reporter noted, very much in passing. Roosevelt made the war seem to be something close to Washington and far from Manila. This is not how it looked in the Philippines, where air raid sirens continued to wail. To Manilans, the war was here, now, happening to us, the reporter wrote. We have no air raid shelters. Good night.